This is Patty Cousins for Business 115 at BYU-Idaho, and this is my explanation of my final exam. So this is my spreadsheet that I've created, and I'm actually starting on the data tab because I want to explain the data. But I've created a nutrition calculator because I want to be able to calculate information about a recipe. So I need to know all of the different components, the individual nutritional data for those components. So my first challenge for this particular project that I wanted to do was to find the data. And so luckily I was able to find a source for the data at a place called myfooddata.com. And they in turn had gotten their data from the US Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Research Service. And so I downloaded this data and I've trimmed the data a bit to make it meet my personal needs because I am the customer for this spreadsheet. And so, but there's about 4,400 individual discrete food items in this database, more than enough to satisfy all the recipes that I cook, and then some. And it had all of the information that I needed. It has calories, protein, fat, carbs, sugar, fiber, etc. And so I can get a lot of good nutritional information out of here. So this is my data source. One thing to note about this data is that the data from myfooddata.com indicated that the default serving size for the data is 100 grams. And since I'm working with standard US recipes, I needed to be able to convert that to something that was more usable than grams. And so ounces are the best next thing because I can convert household common measurements to ounces from recipes very quickly, and then use those ounce measurements to get the data. So they gave me the handy hint that there are 28.4 grams in an ounce. And so I use that later in my calculation. So this is my data set. So then I had to figure out how I was going to work with this data set because there's a lot of data here. But they have very nicely put it into food groups to begin with. So that made it easy for me to create some lists. So each of the categories here has been put into lists. And so then each of the categories of all of the food items within them are named lists from here. And I'll come back to why I did that in a little bit. One of the requirements for this final was to take data from this spreadsheet and convert it using a portion of my BYU-Idaho number. I took a column for data that I'm not terribly interested in, which is phosphorus. I'm not really interested in the nutritional value of phosphorus. And then I created a formula to look at this data that would then replace anything that has a value of 0 in the phosphorus column with the last three digits of my BYU-I number. So you can see here where it has done that appropriately. And I actually referenced this column in the data list over here, but I'm not using the phosphorus column. So, but I did the requirement that was asked for in the exam information. But because I really want to use this, I didn't want to mess with any of the other data that I actually plan to use. The other things that are on this sheet that are important to note, I needed to find out how many ounces are in an egg because there's a lot of recipes with eggs. And so this is actually based on egg size, how many ounces are in an egg. I'll show you how that's being used in a little bit. And then these values over here, I needed to have common spelled out words to use in my converter calculator. And then these are actually values that Excel recognizes and will convert information from a teaspoon to a tablespoon, for instance. So I've created a table here, and you can actually expand these and look at the individual items in them and look at the important pieces of information to me, which were protein, carbs, fat, sugar, and fiber. That was the nutritional data that I was most interested in for this particular pivot chart and pivot table. What I really wanted to see was which of these food groups overall, are higher in carbs. Here we have baked products, they're very high in carbs. Sweets are very high in carbs. Snacks are high in carbs, etc. And then which ones are high in fats and oils, which we'd expect. Which ones are high in protein? So beef products are high in protein. Poultry products are high in protein. If I want to look at an individual category, for instance, breakfast cereals, I can click on breakfast cereals over here in the slicer and just see how it kind of breaks down. Now, these are the sums of the values of, proteins, carbs, etc. but it just gives me a general picture of the category and how it kind of spans across these particular values. So it's kind of interesting, but the most important thing to me is the nutrition calculator. So this is my nutrition calculator. So there's a couple of things in here to note. One of them is, I mentioned I have a conversion tool. So you can enter the amount in the recipe. If the recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of something, how many ounces is that? Well, that's 1 ounce. And my conversion tool, here I use the Excel function for convert, and it then looks up in my chart when I said tablespoon, what does that convert to? And that's TBS. And then ounce is OZ. And so it calculates and converts them and does the lookup to present that information. And then, as I mentioned, eggs, I need to know how many ounces are in a given size of egg. So if I need to change to a large egg, that changes the amount of ounces that I have. And so when I come to use it in my recipe, I can enter the eggs. So it makes it easy to get that information and put it in here. So when I'm deconstructing a recipe to get the nutritional information, I have to select my food category, then I have to select my ingredient from within that category, enter the ounces and amount here, and then it will pull all of the nutritional data and put it here. Once I've entered all of the information for my particular recipe, in this case I'm doing chicken cheese rolls, I've entered all of the data, told it how many servings, it then calculates and tells me how many calories in the overall recipe, and then how many calories per serving, how much protein per serving, how many carbs per serving, etc. So it calculates all of that information out for me based on the data from the USDA. So one of the trickiest parts of what I had to do here, a couple of things. So you recall I told you that I had to convert everything from grams to ounces. So this particular all of these calculations that go across here, this is the formula for how to do that. So I needed to calculate the number of ounces. Then I needed to look at converting, so the data from my data sheet that matched on this particular piece of information. So on my salted butter, it had to go find that, and then I had to convert that to ounces by multiplying it by 0.284. Then I had to multiply that result by how many ounces are in this recipe to then finally arrive at the final value to put here. So that's how this particular calculation works to derive all of this nutritional data. But the most exciting thing I learned from doing this project, and I spent hours and hours and hours looking on the internet trying to figure out how to do this, was how to have a list here, a named list, which we learned how to do in class and is very cool. And then how to have a secondary list that is based upon this selection. And I managed to do that. So I can select any list here in my drop-down. So I can select baby foods. And then I'm presented over here with the list of products for baby foods. So there's baby food information. If I change this, if I change it to, breakfast cereals, this list now reflects breakfast cereals. So the way that I did this was by using, if I look over here, so if I look in this column, of course, these fields are all empty because I'm looking for a named list. So when I come up to the data tab, and I click on data validation, here's the formula. So the formula it's using is called indirect, and the function. So the indirect function says, look at the data that's in this cell C22, and then use that as the source for my list. Well, C22 is a hidden column. So if I unhide this column, in C22, what I'm showing here, for breakfast cereals, if you recall back here on my lists, breakfast cereals, I had something subcategory named cereal next to it. And that's what's displaying in here. So it knows that that is the list to show here. If we go to formulas and look at the name manager, you can see that I have a whole bunch of lists in here, and there's cereal right there. And so it's picking up all of the data associated with cereals. So that's how I did it. It turned out to be this super easy thing once I figured it out, but it sure took a long time to find that magic formula called indirect that would allow me to have a secondary list that was based upon the choice in this one. And I think that is probably one of the most valuable things I learned from this class, in addition to being able to do VLOOKUPs in my sleep. So thank you for a great semester, and I really learned a lot. And I'm going to use this particular nutritional calculator for a long time to come, I'm quite sure. So thanks again for a great semester, and have a Merry Christmas.